Okay, the next thing we need to talk about is exposure. Now, exposure is simply the brightness level or the darkness level of your image. And we can control exposure with the two main mechanical functions of your camera. That's either the aperture, which is the hole in the lens that opens and closes to control the amount of light coming through, or the shutter, which is the trap door basically that opens and closes for a certain time period to record the light for a certain time. Now, specifically, I want to talk to you now about shutter speeds and how we can control the exposure with shutter speeds. Now, I've got our lovely model Kirsty here, who's just going to help us with this demonstration. And I've got a number of my studio lights set up to throw some light onto the scene. Now, these are conventional studio lights that would normally use flash, but I'm just going to use them with the continuous light setting at the moment so that we can better demonstrate shutter speeds and changing shutter speeds. So I'm going to start off with a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. And let's just go in and get a shot of Kirsty at that setting. That's lovely. Here we have a typical view through an SLR camera viewfinder. Circled at the bottom is our shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, and on the right is our exposure scale, currently indicating that we have the correct exposure. Each marker above and below the midpoint indicates a 1/3 stop exposure change. And there we go. Now we can see from that I've got a perfectly exposed picture. Kirsty is the correct exposure. She's not too bright, she's not too dark. But if I change the shutter speed to 2/100th of a second, it's going to be a much faster shutter speed and less light is going to get to our recording medium. So let's do that and show you the result. So changing that to 2/100th of a second. Take the same shot. And now we'll see that this picture is much darker than the previous picture, which was the correct exposure. So there it's too dark at 2/100th of a second. Now, if I reverse that and I go to a slower shutter speed, so I'll go back to 1/100th, but then I'll go another step further. I'll go to a 50th of a second. Then I'm letting in twice as much light as my correct exposure, and the result will be an overexposed image. The picture will be too bright. So let's just try that, adjusting that to a 50th of a second, going into position, take the shot, and there we go. You can see now, on that shot, we are overexposed, and the shot there, the original one at 1/100th of a second, is the correct exposure. Now, what's interesting about what I'm demonstrating there is the difference between a 50th of a second, 1/100th of a second, and 2/100ths of a second. In all of those examples, I'm either doubling the amount of light or I'm halving the amount of light. And that's a really important thing to remember with exposure, because in photography, we use an exposure term called an f-stop change or a one-stop change, two-stop change. A one-stop exposure change means double the amount of light or half the amount of light. And a little bit later, we're going to look in more detail at how one-stop exposures affect the image. Now, when you're talking about understanding exposure and changing exposure, when you change the shutter speed to make the picture brighter or more overexposed, you can also change the aperture to compensate. So as you change one, you can change the balance of the other to bring the picture back to the correct exposure. But what I want to demonstrate, this was just taken on a pro level SLR camera. Let's take the same shots on a more entry level DSLR with the same shutter speed settings, just to prove the point that it's exactly the same on any camera. So let me just change camera bodies. And I'm just going to pop this lens onto this entry level DSLR. And let's go. We're using the camera in manual mode. And let's change the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second, which was our starting point on the other camera. And let's take the same shot. So just into position there for me, Kirsty. Fantastic. And there we go. I've got a picture of Kirsty, and she is at the correct exposure. So I'll now change that shutter speed to 2/100th of a second. There we can see it changing on the screen. And let's take that shot again. And now we'll have a picture that's darker. So we had the darker exposure and the correct exposure. And then if I go to 50th of a second, that doubles the exposure from the original correct exposure of 100th. So that's a one-stop change. Take the shot again. And now we'll have a picture that is overexposed. So in all of those instances, I've changed the shutter speed, which has changed the exposure, but I did not change the aperture to compensate. So that way I was able to overexpose the image or underexpose the image. If I had changed the aperture at the same time, I could have got the exposure balance correct to suit the image that I was taking. But those are the key things to understand with changes in exposure using the shutter speed alone. And as I mentioned, in a short while, we'll look in more detail at those one-stop exposure changes.
But first, we need to show you how to adjust the shutter speed on your SLR camera by using the camera's main display screen and adjustment dial.
Okay, so how do we change those shutter speeds on your camera? Well, it's really simple. You've got your input control dial just here, and you adjust the wheel like so, and that changes the shutter speed, as you can see here. Now that is using the camera in full manual mode, and that is the best way to learn photography. If you start following this course using your camera in full manual mode, controlling the shutter speed manually and controlling the aperture manually, then you will get much better results and a much better understanding of photography more quickly. So let's just have a look at that again on changing the shutter speed. I've got the control wheel on the camera, and as I rotate it, the shutter speed is changing, as you can see there. And there's our 100th of a second, there's our 50th of a second, and there's our 200th. And we can change this all the way over on this camera up to 4,000th of a second. And I'm doing that by using the camera in manual mode. So the camera is set to the M position on the dial for full manual control. Now, if we wanted to control the aperture, noticed as I was changing the shutter speed, our aperture or F number is not changing. If I hit the aperture value button, it changes it to there, and then we can also change the aperture setting independently of the shutter speed.
In this example, the correct exposure balance is achieved by f11 at 1/60th of a second. If I change the shutter speed to 1/125th of a second, I lose one stop of light and the exposure balance becomes underexposed. To correct for this, I have to open the aperture by one stop to f8. That brings the exposure back to the correct balance. By opening the aperture by another stop to f5.6, the image will now be overexposed and out of balance. And to compensate, I can change the shutter speed by one stop to 1/250th of a second, and we achieve the correct balance.
So we've looked at exposure changes using the shutter speed. But what I want to look at next is exposure changes in what's called a full f-stop jump at a time. That's a one-stop exposure change. So let's take a look at this graphic. Here we have a picture that is underexposed. It's very dark. And as we move down the scale, that picture gets lighter and lighter and lighter until we get right down here when the picture is actually overexposed. It's too light or it's too bright. But what we need to understand is what each of those changes represent. And if we look at the numbers alongside the images, you'll see that these indicate shutter speeds. And here we have 1,000th of a second, 500th, 250th, 1/250th, 60th, and so on. And as that shutter speed gets slower and slower, the picture gets lighter and lighter. But what you'll also notice is that there is a pattern emerging here, and that is that 500th, 250th, 1/250th, 60th, each time we go down the scale, the number is halved. Each time we go up the scale, the number is doubled effectively. And that doubling or halving of exposure is called a one-stop change. So basically, doubling the amount of light is a one-stop brighter change. Halving the amount of light is a one-stop darker change. Now, if we move over to this scale, we have what's called the aperture numbers or the F numbers. And here, for example, we have f22, changing to f16, f11, f8, so on. And each one of these changes is also a one-stop change at a time. However, the aperture numbers are not so easy to follow as the shutter speed changes in terms of that doubling or halving. The way the aperture numbers are calculated is a little bit different. However, the number change here between f16 and f11 is still a one-stop change. That is, going from f16 to f11 is double the amount of light. Going from f11 to f8 is double the amount of light. Whereas going from f4 to f5.6 is half the amount of light. So let's take a look at these aperture numbers on a conventional or one of the older camera lenses. Here I've got a camera lens off an older camera, and in the old days the cameras used to have the aperture setting changes on the lens barrel like I've got here. And if we take a look at this, you'll see that we've got f3.5, f5.6, which is the number we've got here, then f8, the number we've got here, then f11, f16 and f22. So each one of those clicks on that aperture setting on the lens is a one-stop change. And if we look at that in relations to real terms of what's actually happening in there, if I close the aperture down, you can see the aperture getting smaller and smaller as I change the aperture settings there. So each one of those changes is halving the amount of light, halving it again, halving it again, halving it again, doubling it, doubling the amount of light, doubling the amount of light, and doubling it again, and so on. So those are full f-stop changes on the aperture setting. But that's on the older cameras and the older lenses. How do we make that same change on a modern DSLR camera? Well, let's take a look at the DSLR camera. And you can see here where we've got our shutter speeds that we were changing earlier. But over here, by pressing the AV button in, and the AV stands for aperture value, it allows us to change the aperture settings here. Now let me run this setting down to 2.8, for example. 2.8 is the setting that you can see here. And then as I change the aperture setting, you can see I can get it to f4, which matches f4. Then I can get it to f5.6, which matches again, f8, f11, f16, f22. So I am changing the exposure in one-stop changes. Now, what you may have noticed there was that there were additional numbers in between each of the settings. So between 2.8 and f4, there was 3.5. Or between f8 and f11, there was f9. And that's because modern DSLR cameras have the ability to change exposure in 1/3 stop increments. So that gives you more control over the exposure level change, the amount of brightness or the amount of darkness. But it is still very important to remember exposure changes referred to as a one-stop change. Once you understand exposure changes in increments of a stop at a time, that is doubling the amount of light or halving the amount of light, you'll better understand much of the photography terminology that is used.